Hi everyone, and welcome to D&D Horror Stories with D&D Doge. In today's video, we have a story about a Dungeons & Dragons player that constantly bails on a campaign, but then gets upset when the rest of the players play without him. A story about a dungeon master using crit fails to make a player's character useless, and much more. But before we get into those, Simba would like you to like, comment, and subscribe. You wouldn't want to disappoint Simba, would you? But with that said, let's get into some D&D horror stories. The Player Who Loves D&D But Doesn't Play It by Reddit user TimeTap. Honestly, I could have probably picked a better title, and this might not really be much of a horror story, but well, hear me out. Also, English isn't my first language, so sorry in advance. I've got a group of friends I've known for a long time. Love them to bits. A few years ago, like 4 years now, they said they wanted to try D&D. I was already super into D&D back then, playing and DMing a lot, so they asked me to DM for them. We started playing this homebrew world I made, and for the most part, it went really well. Like, really well. There were 5 players, and me as the DM. I know my friends don't like all the same stuff, so I made sure there was a bit of everything in the game. Some of them really loved role-playing, while others were more into combat and exploring. Up to this point, things were fine, right? But after about a year, some problems started popping up. One of my players, who's a really good friend of mine, likes to play combo characters, min-maxed ones, not sure what the right word is. And honestly, I don't mind that. The issue is more with him. He usually builds these super min-maxed characters that are amazing at one thing, but kind of useless in everything else. I feel like he gets so into the mechanics that he doesn't stop to think if he'll even enjoy playing that character. So the first problems started when he came to me saying that he wasn't enjoying his character, the first one in that campaign, which honestly is fine. We're not always going to love our characters, right? So I told him he could make a new one, and I'd figure out a way to blend the new character in and the old one out. No big deal. I just wanted him to play something he'd enjoy more. And surprise, surprise, he started as a fighter, but then came back with a rogue multiclass, because, in his words, now I can do an absurd amount of damage. Which, cool, if that's what he's into. I think that character lasted 5 sessions maybe. Then, he wanted to change again, and this has been going on for years. I've honestly lost track of how many characters he's switched through. But hey, I usually just let him do his thing. It's not really the problem. The real problem started during our last few sessions, which for context were almost a year ago. You'll see why. He was there, but not present. Since we don't live in the same city, we play online. But I noticed that during the sessions, he wasn't doing anything. Like, no talking, no taking action, nothing. During combat, he'd say something, but only when I called on him because of initiative. I figured maybe he was just tired, as life happens. But it kept getting worse. Then, he straight up didn't show up for a session and sent a message a few hours later saying he was sorry, but someone called him to play football, and he forgot to let us know. That happened once, then twice, and by the 3rd time, I just stopped scheduling sessions altogether. Look, no one's forcing you to play D&D if you don't want to, right? But at least give us the courtesy of saying so. Fast forward a few months, and one random Tuesday, I wake up to so many texts from this player asking, "When's our next session? I really want to play. I'm craving D&D. So I responded with, "We're already playing a different campaign with another group. We told you about it, and you didn't care. We don't play that campaign anymore." For context, 3 players and I had started a new campaign. The 4th player didn't have much time anymore and decided not to join. And when we told this guy, he could have cared less, so we just moved on. Apparently, he was appalled by this, like absolutely offended. He hit us with, "But I love D&D," and claimed that we weren't being understanding enough. He seriously expected us to just sit around and wait for him to be in the mood to play. Only play when he could, wanted to, or felt like it. He spent months without even mentioning playing. He just did his own thing. And then, out of nowhere, when he suddenly decides that he wants to play, he's shocked that we're already playing without him? Like, dude, no. Just no. Now, here's where the horror story really starts. He began aggressively texting the group, calling us a-holes, and a lot worse. It wasn't in English, so I'm not sure how all the translations go. Then, it escalated to personal insults, and that's where I drew the line completely. Look, he was a very good friend of mine, but this isn't how you handle things. He could have just talked to us like an adult. Maybe we could have set up a one-shot or something to scratch that itch. But you can't act that irresponsibly and then expect people to coddle you or wait around forever. We ended up kicking him out of the group. I didn't block him or anything, but he hasn't reached out to me since. And honestly, it's sad. We've been friends for so long. Why not just talk to us like adults? Things could have been handled so much better. But oh well. Don't get me wrong, I still care about him. I still think he's a good person. He's just not in the right place right now. Yeah, that is a bit of a messed up situation. First, when this player just did not show up to a session because he was invited to play football and did not inform OP and the other players is really inconsiderate. But then, to do that 2 more times is just outrageous. Playing D&D with a group is a commitment, and each person relies on all the others for a game to stay together. I mean, sure, sometimes people need to cancel because life stuff happens, but to cancel so that you can go play football kinda leaves the rest of the group hanging. So I don't blame OP for just not including him in the games after he did that 3 times. But then, after a year of not asking about D&D, to suddenly get offended and call the other people in the group names for starting a new campaign without him is ridiculous. Like OP said, if this player really wanted to scratch the D&D itch, OP could have set up a one-shot or something. But no. Instead, he decided to act like a child. Hopefully, this player will realize how much of an a-hole he was and apologize to everyone. And possibly, they could all play together again, at least for a one-shot. Let's move on. The Wet Room of Darkness by Reddit user ItchyInfluence5737. I posted this as a comment a while back, and have been told a couple of times that I should put it in as a post, so here goes. Nearly 15 years ago now, a fellow I was dating pretty casually was invited to play D&D by a superior at his work. So he and a few of his coworkers showed up at the guy's house and got started. After rolling characters, his superior, the dungeon master, says to them, "You all awaken, but at first aren't sure that you have. The darkness is total, and all you can tell is that you're in an enclosed space with about an inch of liquid on what seems to be a stone and dirt floor." So he and his buddies then spent a total of about 2 hours doing things like trying to taste the water, it tastes exactly like muddy water. Screamed to see if they could get some idea of what was going on via the sound of the echoes. They couldn't, etc. One of the players had a spell that made light, but when they tried to cast it, the Dungeon Master said, "You recite the incantation and perform the somatics, but the darkness remains absolute." They called it after about 2 hours, and my fella told me about it over lunch a few days later. Wow. We were both giggling over it and kinda coming up with half-hearted explanations for what was going on. So he got invited back to the next session, not the next week, but the week after, and went, thinking that maybe something had happened while he was away, and they were actually going to do something. But nope. He gets there, and everyone is still in this wet room, unable to see. After about an hour of the same sort of thing, my fellow zoned out, and by the time they called the session, no forward progress had been made. A couple of days later, he and I met up to shoot pool, and he told me about it again, and that he had apparently been invited to a third session, but had made up an excuse. He was not invited back, and I guess things were mildly awkward between he and his superior after that for a little while. He left for another job about 8 months later, and asked one of his coworkers what had come of that game, and the guy told him that everyone had gotten frustrated and an argument had broken out, but the Dungeon Master had been unwilling to budge, so they all decided they were done with it. Well, that had to be a confusing experience. That Dungeon Master must have had some sort of specific thing that he wanted the players to do, but would not give them any clue on what that thing was, and was unwilling to budge. I just find it confusing that the players went to multiple sessions like that with nothing happening, and that the DM didn't get bored by just having the players stuck with seemingly no way out. I don't blame OP for making up an excuse to not go back to that game, because I really would not call that a game at all. So yeah, just dumbfounding. On to the next post. The Case of the Magical Bowstring, aka the story of the worst campaign I ever joined, by Reddit user Full Torso Apparition. I have dropped out of exactly one D&D game in my 23 years of playing, and this is that story. It was 2008, and I'd been playing often with my friend Andrew. Several times, he talked about his main campaign that he ran for 4 of his high school friends, and how much fun they had. Intrigued, I asked to join, and was invited in. At this point, they'd been playing for a year, and were level 12. I opted to play a Ranger Scout, and since we were starting at a high level, I asked what magic items I could have. Andrew said I could have a single +1 weapon, and one other minor magic item. So I picked a +1 longbow and a magical quiver. This seemed odd, but I figured it must be a low magic campaign. I show up to the first session, and everything seems fine at first. We introduce my character and engage in some light roleplay. Then I learned that 2 of the other players still had their original characters, the cleric and the wizard, while the other 2 had gone through several throughout the campaign. Nothing odd there, necessarily, but I then learned that the wizard and cleric had used this as an opportunity to hoard all of the dead characters' magic items, as well as all the relevant plot hooks. Since the DM didn't like characters starting with magic items, this meant that cleric and wizard had tons of magic items between the 2 of them, while the rest of us had a smattering of +1 weapons and trinkets. Also, because cleric and wizard had the only relevant plot hooks, it meant the rest of us were apparently unimportant. Any course of action I suggested that they didn't like was met with, "We don't know you, so you can just leave if you don't like it." This applied not only to me, but the other two players as well. Through all of this, Andrew kept completely silent and seemed content to let it play out. After the first session, I listened to the other players complain about the situation for over an hour after a wizard and cleric left. I agreed to attempt some pushback, and they would back me up. This was all done in the presence of Andrew, who seemed to understand the situation. When I attempted to follow through with the plan, the other players and the DM simply watched it happen. Nothing was done, and we continued on with the wizard and cleric show after being told once again that my character could, quote, "just leave," if I did not like their decisions. I was dumbfounded. The last straw was when we finally got into our first dungeon as a party. During the second combat, I rolled a nat 1 on an attack, so Andrew says that my bowstring has broken. Okay, critical fails are a crappy house rule, but whatever. I can finish the fight with javelins and restring my bow after the fight. We cleaned up the remaining enemies, and I told the DM that I was going to restring my bow. This is when he decided to tell me that I couldn't restring my bow because it's a magic bow, and therefore requires a magic bowstring. I argued that a magic bowstring probably shouldn't be able to break then, but I was told that I rolled a nat 1, so that's what happened. I complained that I was an archer, and he had just taken away one of the only 2 magic items he gave me. He didn't care, and everyone seemed to think it was funny. I tried to carry on, but after that, I was done, and exited from the game. It just goes to show how group dynamics can be so different from one table to the next. In all of our other games, Andrew had been very fun and reasonable, but around his high school friends, it was a different story. Man, talk about a slap in the face. Now, don't get me wrong, crit fails can be fun sometimes in D&D, but usually during roleplay, or when trying to pick a lock or something. To take a nat 1 and make the critical fail be a player's main weapon breaking in the middle of combat just takes away the fun of the game, in my opinion. And to then not let OP restring the bow afterwards was just the cherry on top of that BS Sunday. And as far as the cleric and wizard hoarding all the previous characters' magic items, I mean, they can only attune to 3 of them each, so they could have given some of them to the other players' characters in order for them to actually benefit the party. Though the way they sounded, they liked the control that they had over them, as much as they enjoyed having the plot hooks being primarily attached to their characters. The Dungeon Master should have done more to have the newer character stories be woven into said plot hooks, so that those 2 didn't have a monopoly on where they went or how the story played out. Honestly, it just sounds like the DM was catering to these 2 just because they were his friends in high school, as a way to impress them or something. As it sounds like OP plays with this DM in other games, and the DM has a whole different dynamic in those games. So yeah, I don't blame OP for just leaving that game after all of that. Though, what are your thoughts on crit fails? Do you use them in your games? And if so, to what extent? I'd love to hear your opinions. But with that said, let's move on. Should I tell my Dungeon Master that I don't like the new player, or should I keep silent? By Reddit user Green Bottles Arcanum. So, I've been playing in a Foundry virtual tabletop game, Dungeon Mastered by an old friend, for just over half a year now. This game is through startplaying.games, and I was more than happy to jump in and pay the $15 a week to support a friend. The guy basically got me into Pathfinder, and I was in a home game at his house for something like 4 or 5 years. He helped me a lot when I was getting to terms with my autism and severe depression. Now fast forward to this SPG game, and we've been the same exact group of 4 every week, except for the very first session, where we had this guy who had to bow out after the first game due to a schedule. 30 or so sessions later, we've just hit level 13, and are still powering through the modules and having a blast. The issue came about 3 sessions ago, when we logged in for the session to discover there was a new player named Steve. I don't have anything against him as a person, and his class and build even contributes greatly to the party. But it's the other things. He keeps talking over people to say something that we can't hear because he's mumbling. He'll say stuff about his modifiers as if he's hoping it would change the outcome of a roll, despite the fact that we've told him basically every turn that everything is already calculated by Foundry. Every time it comes to his turn, he seems to have no idea what he plans to do, or even what's been happening. And all in all, it just feels like a huge wrench has been thrown into the dynamic and slowed us all down. Things kind of came to a head last session for all of this, when he seemed to have to restart his browser at the start of every one of his turns, and would only tell us that after a minute of not telling us what he's getting frustrated with when we're trying to ask what he wants to do, or trying in any way of helping. He's even been asked to get a proper mouse, as the broken trackpad on his laptop barely registers with Foundry apparently, and he flat out ignores the Dungeon Master every time it comes up. By the end of the last session, both the Dungeon Master and I just started rolling his attacks for him after he said he was going to do X, because his sheet was open and it kept taking him 1 to 2 minutes each time just to press the button. And when he did, it wouldn't actually target the enemy or hit the right attack. Then, we had a big fight where we cornered the last 3 enemies in one room with our barbarian, and I cast, at his suggestion, a super powerful 6th level area spell that was dealing 30 to 50 damage to each enemy every round, and he said he was going to go into the room. We all told him that the moment he walked into the spell that I just cast 30 seconds ago, he would take 8d8 damage or whatever. He goes, "Okay, that's probably a bad idea." Then he waffles with what he wants to do, and then walks into the room anyways. He obviously takes the damage, but he doesn't even realize it somehow until after he gets through all of his attacks, because he was talking over the Dungeon Master. He then goes, "Oh, what's that green circle? Why am I taking damage?" And I think my patience just broke there. I have been a forever DM since day 1, and I rarely get to actually be a player. And on top of that, I ran community games for young kids for a good 5 years before COVID. I understand and fully support the adage that everyone is an equal player, and that we should all support everyone at the table. But with that, doesn't that also mean that I should tell my friend that I've been getting increasingly stressed out by this new player that keeps interrupting the dynamic that we've had for ages? As a note, I don't recall it ever being fielded to us that a new player might be joining. Is my autism, discomfort, and to be honest, the fact that I'm paying quite a sum to be in this game valid enough to bring up my feelings? Or am I crossing a line by bringing it up to the DM? I am supposed to be in another game of his tonight, and I just discovered that he was going to be in that one too, so I'm really worried how I will do multiple games with him. Well, I'm of the mind that when a new player is being considered to join an ongoing game, that everyone in the group should be able to give their input, whether it's a paid game or not. Now, with that being said, if this new player is bothering OP, it's always best to bring up those issues with the DM. That way, the DM knows how OP feels, and can maybe work with the new player to rectify the issues with said player talking over others, actually having him get a mouse for his laptop so that he can actually play properly on Foundry. I mean, seriously, you can get a cheap mouse for like $5 nowadays. And have said player pay attention during battles and plan his actions ahead of time so it doesn't hold up the flow of the game. So yeah, my advice would be to speak to your DM. Though, what advice would you give OP here? But that is all I have for you today. As always, I appreciate all of you, and may your games remain horror story free. Until next time.